Well, here we are after our very fantastic lightning striking introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Gwenda, the fearless prophet of truth. It's been a little while since I've seen you. What have you been doing? And what have you been noticing in your neighbourhood, around the place? What have you been saying to people about things that you are noticing? You know, when I was a child, I watched the Jetsons. Did you watch the Jetsons? Some of us did, some of us didn't. But the Jetsons was funny because I would look at those cartoon characters that were wearing a watch on their hand that they could call people on and see them. Now, that to me as a child was absurd. And what do we have today? Watches that can do everything a computer can do. So what was the message in that show, The Jetsons? You know, we've had lots of our way of life disturbed in this last 4 years, and we've seen things come to life that we may have seen in cartoons, in movies, read in a book. The recent thing that has got everybody questioning is digital ID. And that kind of took me back to a book that you may all know, and that is George Orwell's book, 1984. So a lot of students had to read that book, but it said that they read it and soon forgot it. But by gee, it came back to life in 2020 and 2021. It was a hot topic. And there was lots going around the internet that referenced 1984. Why was that? Are you aware of it? Another show that comes to mind is the ridiculous reality show. You can see I wasn't a fan. Big Brother, staged out of Queensland. I believe there was also a sister show to it out of the USA. But was that not enough for people to go, really? I don't know that I would want to be watched 24/7. Or was that reality show to give you a taste of what was going to become real for you? Have you ever thought about that? You know, so many of the movies, books and things over the years, I mean, the George Orwell book wasn't written in 1984. It was written in something like 1949 or maybe even earlier. But that's not the only book or show. There's another one that maybe you haven't heard of, but it was very popular in the early 90s, and it went through to mid-90s, and it's called Persons of Interest. If you haven't watched that TV series, I would strongly suggest that you go and have a look at it. The basis of that show is a man who decided he wanted to do something that was going to help the level of criminals on the street and keep people more secure. So he created a machine that had facial identity, facial recognition. His intention was good, but then the government decided, and some other agencies, that they could use it for different purposes. Facial recognition of everybody on the street, targeting people who had done nothing. All of these shows have a very big message. So my guest today is Paul Conlon. Paul is the author of a soon-to-be released book called Digital ID. He's an engineer, product manager, author, ex-army officer. But one thing Paul and I share is being freedom advocates. Paul is a freedom advocate on a mission to empower the individual to step up for their responsibility and ownership of their lives. And you know what? Everything changes when each individual takes that empowerment and moves forward. So in our fabulous conversation today, I'm going to bring you some amazing insights. And it's my greatest pleasure to introduce you Dr. Paul Conlon. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Gwenda. What a heartfelt introduction. I'm blessed to hear that. It's my privilege to be joining you today.
It's a thrill to have you on, and this topic is a fantastic topic, and more so that you have put something out there that is going to be able to be like the 1984 George Orwell book, and generations will still be talking about the Paul Conlon book from 2024 as they do George Orwell's book, but on a very different level and for a very different reason. What I'd like you to share with us first, Paul, is what is identity and why does it matter?
Yeah, that's one of those questions, Gwenda, that's very easy to ask and very difficult to answer, actually. In fact, that question alone was one of the reasons why I started writing this book, because as I started to study the topic of identity, particularly related to digital ID, I realized that we as a species don't really understand what our identity is. And I can go into some details about why that is. But the overlay, I think, behind the book is, and certainly in my experience, is I found a lot of people have this general hesitation about digital ID. Common people who aren't necessarily technical, there seems to be this thread of suspicion about it, perhaps even uniquely among all the various political topics that are unraveling at the moment. Yet the only thing I sort of saw in public discourse was, in terms of an argument against digital ID, is we don't want to adopt China's social credit system. That seemed to be the only example that people would run to, and I don't blame people for that. It's a bit of an abstract topic, and so I essentially wrote the book, at least in part, to walk through from first principles as much as I can. What is identity? Why is it valuable? And how does that lead into the fact that digital ID is, in my opinion, very dangerous? So, yeah, what is human identity? A short and quick answer is it's the way that we express ourselves in the physical world. And again, that's a fairly abstract kind of concept.
Yep.
And what I found through my study of human identity is that it's very tightly coupled or linked with our lived experience. So as we radiate our identity into the world, it enables people to have influence over our lives. And that's unique in my experience. There's no other aspect, there's no other type of data that I've found that has that coupling to our lived experience. So I did a little bit of research, obviously quite a bit of research, and I found that in the public space, there's quite a broad spectrum of opinions on what human identity is. And I'm not sure if you're aware of Dr. Zach Bush, the intrinsic health advocate.
Oh, no.
Okay, he raised a very interesting question about identity. He said he's seen, and I'm sure many other physicians have seen, people die, as defined by the absence of brain activity, respiratory function, heartbeats, and then sometimes they just inexplicably return to life. Now, importantly, they don't return to life as someone else. They don't have different political views or speak other languages or have different memories. So where did those identity characteristics go during a period of death? That's a difficult question to answer. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people like entrepreneur Alex Hormozi, who specializes in putting people's characteristics into methods and processes for commercial gain. And he defines identity as nothing more than internal culture. So a set of behaviors or mannerisms exhibited by an individual in the same way you'd see culture in a business. And but I find that quite unsatisfying as well, because we're clearly not all walking chat GPT prompts. You know, there's free will in there somewhere. There's the human spirit. So my takeaway is that there's no clear answer to what identity is. And so we shouldn't be building safety critical systems on the exposure of our identity information, at least until we mature a little bit more as a species and understand what that is. The reason why it's important, as I mentioned before, is it is tightly coupled to our lived experience. And we see examples of this everywhere in life, actually. So take professional fighters. They will methodically study videos of their opponent's previous fights to look for certain tells, certain characteristics. You know, this opponent I've got coming up favors a left hook, and I can use knowledge of that characteristic about them against them, and that can be lead to direct benefits like prize money and prestige. And poker players, their whole career is predicated on not showing any identifying characteristics, any tells, as the term goes, because that can be used against them. So they're just basic examples of how our characteristics can be interpreted by other people and be used against us, usually, in ways that we just can't predict. So prevention is better than cure in many cases. And I devote the entire chapter to identity in my book, and hopefully that serves to educate people enough about how important and ill-defined identity is, to the point where they understand that we shouldn't be giving it away so freely.
There's so much richness in what you've just shared with us. There's a lot to take in. And I think that this is a really important part for people to get their head around when it comes to understanding digital identity. Because from what you've been explaining there, and the two fellows, Dr. Zach Bush and Alex Hormozy, was it?
Hormozy.
Even there's two very different perspectives, if you like, and one's a little bit more harsh, a little bit more clinical, business orientated, and we are not that. We are a living, feeling being, an incredible physical creation, and not one of us is the same as the other, even though people love to say, oh, you look just like your great-grandfather, or you've got your mother's big hips. That does not define us, and yet people are willing to take that on as their identity. So already they separate themselves from themselves by willingly wanting to take on the identity of their grandparent or whoever. One thing that you did say was, as we radiate our identity, we are affected by others. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's an intrinsic spirit that we all carry with us, but that's not tangibly manifested with the senses that we have. All we can see of other people really is the echoes of that spirit, what we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears. But those echoes are tainted by our own experiences. So I'll give you another example. My wife's hairdresser comes from New South Wales, and no one would know that about her except for the fact that her car, when she moved up, had New South Wales registration plates on it. Now, at the period of time when the border was closed between these states, people saw that number plate from a southern state and imposed upon her, just this lady they didn't know driving around in a car in public, imposed upon her their prejudices, their fears, their past experiences. And she had an instance, at least one, where people actually threw glass bottles at her car as she was driving around because of the identifying nature of the number plate. Now, that number plate represents many aspects that we are radiating. You may have had a bad experience at one point in your past with someone who wore a black shirt, and here you are talking with someone in a black shirt, and you might not even, I'm sure you would be, but many people might not even be conscious of the fact that they have a collection of experiences that they've accumulated, and that there are prejudices that we carry with us, and they can be attached very easily to what we see and assume about other people. So it's a very interesting characteristic about our species. Because we don't really know who we are, the best we can do is pigeonhole and characterize certain characteristics and try and put square pegs into round holes, and I'm a this or I'm a that, and we have these labels. And then once you get into labeling people, you go down the dark path of dehumanization, which generally doesn't lead to good places.
No, you're one step ahead of me there, Paul. I was going to say, so in our introduction, talking about Paul is an engineer, Paul is an ex-army officer, Paul is this. all labels, nothing to do with who Paul really is. And often when you're introduced to someone, people say, "What do you do?" And hardly anybody responds with what they do. They immediately plant labels on themselves. "Oh, I am," and they own it. And there's also been, this is a big part of this conversation, because there's been a big push about ownership. Owning this, own your work, own who you are. But it's not being driven from that intrinsic essence, the spirit of you. If someone has done a lot of inner work, as it's called, really gone to introspection and wanted to peel off those layers of labels and who they believe themselves to be, then they find a whole different being. I'm not going to say an identity, because it's not an identity. Identity is something that has been put upon us, that has been taught to us, and now here we are faced with digital identity. Paul, what would be the difference in digital identity and in the fantastic work in your book to open minds and offer different perspectives on these things, so people go, well, they've had it all the time anyway, because I've got a driver's license, I've got a tax file number, I've got a Medicare card. So what does it matter?
So that's one of the go-to arguments, and I use that term very loosely because it's not an argument. It's I think a bit of a self-defense mechanism. But that I hope is explained throughout the course of my book. So these people are right, that the government and private corporations as well do hold a lot of information on us. Now, it requires a little bit of an understanding on how data works, but it is very important that data is siloed or firewalled. It is contained in a certain context that only has relevance within that context. So the act of centralizing data, and by that I mean bringing all these different pieces of knowledge together in one place, itself is inherently dangerous. You don't even need to expand the amount of data that is out there on you without to represent much greater danger. And there are various reasons for that. So in my book, I go through history to try and make the case of why centralization is particularly nefarious. And it's actually one thing that I found that was identified throughout history as something that is inherently dangerous in itself. So in my book, I use my family's history in Nazi Germany, where identity was weaponized by the government quite novelly and uniquely, actually. And one of the examples that I use in the book is the case of when the German army occupied new territories. So here speaks to the value of identity. The first supporting people behind the army when new territory was conquered was census takers. They immediately came in, segregated people, and acquired as much information as they could on the land and the people within the land that they've just conquered. Now, at the time, information was stored in analog form. It was very segregated. It was hard to access. It was slow. And so it required laborious efforts from people sympathetic to the cause to bring all of this information together. And I'll give you another example. One of the types of information available at the time were kind of court records. But court records, court cases are very tightly scoped. They hold information, trial evidence specific to the particular case. Religion, for example, or many other areas of our lives, if it wasn't relevant to the case, it just could not be found in those court records. But when we talk about centralizing identity, you link your court records up to your driver's license, up to your employment history, up to everything else. And there is a wealth of information that can be extrapolated just from bringing those things together. It was identified in the Australia card of the 1980s, which you probably remember. That was the centralization of data was identified as a threat in itself. So unfortunately, the people who try to maybe hide behind the fact that there's already this data out there, so why bother, I think are fundamentally missing the point and are perhaps looking for excuses to not face some rather difficult questions.
Yes, or is it more a case of if I stay ignorant, I'm safe? I prefer to be ignorant. I don't really want to know. I've heard people say this in the last 4 years. I don't really want to know what's going on. It doesn't bother me, which astounds me. But that, again, is another defensive action, defensive position to take. And I think the other thing too is the complacency. What does it matter? What are they going to do with it? It doesn't matter. It does matter, doesn't it, Paul? It does matter a lot, not just for us now, but our future generations. Now, you spoke briefly about your family history being in Nazi Germany. So this book that I can't wait for it to be released is going to be incredible. But what was it? Among everything else that's gone on the last 4 years, I'm sure it's not just the last 4 years that brought you to write this, but what was it that really, what runs deep within you that has brought this into play?
Oh boy, that's one of those where do I start type things. I have very fond memories of my grandmother, who was a teenage girl who lived in a German town, then on the Polish border, and actually told me many stories when I was growing up of those times. And she remembers September 39 when she heard the tanks roll into Poland. She was physically there at the start of World War II. And she, in later life, I realized that she was educating me about certain fundamental features of life without me even knowing it. And I use one quote from her that I remember from my childhood. I can't remember the context. I was at her house and I was a fairly young boy, and I'd made some comment about something, and she said, "Don't trust governments at about that pace." And that just struck me like a truck, knowing her history and the fact that she carried that through her life. So as best I can sum it up, my experience with her character and what she was generous enough to convey to me before her passing was that you do care about your identity. You do care about who knows about it, and you do care about your freedom. And these things are all interrelated. And I don't think anyone has a particular argument against that. And I'll tell you why. We all have preferences. So I might like to get up at 6 a.m. and have a black coffee before going to the job that I've chosen, and return to the house where that I've chosen to buy in the suburb that I like to live in. All of these preferences I can enjoy in my life because I have some ability to manipulate my life and turn my desires into reality. If you don't have individual freedom, none of that matters. And it doesn't matter what these preferences are. You might enjoy fishing with your friends on the weekend or streaming Netflix all weekend. So if you like anything at all, even being alive and eating your favorite food, then by default, you value your identity and your individual freedom. So again, I think it's unfortunately one of those kind of shortcut answers that people hide behind when they say, what does it matter? Because if you have any preference or desire to control any aspect of your life at all, and let's be honest, we all do, as exemplified by everyone who's felt the sting of tyranny in the past, then unfortunately you need to start caring now, because we are at a moment in history, I think, where complacency has become very costly and will continue to do so. And I also make the case too that talking about ownership that you raised before, the freedoms that we do have now were not earned by us. They were earned by gallant men and women who lived and bled and died before us, and they were gifted to us. And you might be able to argue that we're kind of on the trailing end of that gift, but this is not ours to give away. The liberties that we have now are not ours to give away. I think we have an obligation to pay them forward through whatever, by going through whatever difficulty we need to go through. Because when you think of gifting our children something substandard, something less than what we were gifted, that just leaves a pretty foul taste in my mouth as far as I'm concerned. And today's abnormal can very easily become tomorrow's normal. And particularly when you're talking about adding identification into areas of life that we don't expect it to be in, or where it isn't currently in at the moment. We've certainly seen examples of that in recent years. We can very easily envisage a future where children are completely comfortable and have normalized having to identify themselves to get on a bus or do anything kind of trivial that we wouldn't consider now. And they could only just dream and imagine of a time where you didn't have to identify yourself to some artificial authority to do anything at all, including getting up at 6 a.m. and having black coffee. So we do need to keep what is normal now normal into the future if we value it. And I think it's a story that's bigger than ourselves.
Oh, very much, very much. But there's got to be those of us that bring awareness forward and a better, different perspective. I prefer it as better, different. One thing I want to add to what your grandmother said to you is during 2020, 2021, I was talking to an Italian gentleman, and he said to me the word government in Italy and how his grandmother and parents raised him. Government means govern your mental self. So government is to govern the mental state of the people, and they do it very well. When it comes to words you used, chosen, preference, it's my preference to live here, it's my choice to get up at 6 a.m. I really don't feel that people realise there won't be that. And the fact, do you really want to be watched everywhere you go? And the word, Paul, that has been used repeatedly since 2020 in particular is safe. We're keeping you safe. So the new facial recognition cameras we've got up are just to keep you safe. And this is another dodgem thing that I hear people saying, oh, isn't it great? And I say, what's great? And they say, well, I'm safe now. And I think, gosh, what happened? What happened to your unique self, your true self? What happened to you that you feel by being watched everywhere and having these facial recognition cameras up means you're safe? No.
There's a lot to unpack there. I devote some time in the book to exactly that as well. If you were safe, you are not alive. Life is inherently and necessarily unsafe. Albert Camus put this quite well. The welfare of the people has always been the tool of tyrants, and it has the added advantage of giving the servants of tyranny a good conscience. And we saw this was a classic through the American Revolutionary War, where it was clearly identified, again, from the first-hand experiences of those who have experienced the sting of tyranny, that safety and freedom are incompatible. You end up having neither at all. And how do you define the word safe? What does that mean? And who has the power to define these terms? We're in quite a fluid legislative environment, I find at the moment, particularly when it comes around the topic of freedom of speech. Now, if we're going to build systems around one-word motivators, then we need to be very careful that we have complete freedom to debate what the definitions of terms are. And we just, I think, by any sort of reasonable metric, don't have that at the moment. So, and this is a classic debating thing as well, where often it's the definition of terms, and Socrates said the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. It's the definition of terms where you usually find the majority of conflicts. If you have an hour debate, you can devote 55 minutes to defining terms correctly, and usually the last 5 minutes just falls out quite naturally. But the problem is when someone uses a word safe or any word, what they're actually saying is they're replacing a complex set of experiences with one word that they happen to have internally associated with those experiences. Now, the other person who hears that word is relating it to their own sense of experiences. So they actually have completely different mental models participating in the same conversation. So it could not be a weaker case to use a word like that or a term like that just feels nice. That's completely counter to being alive, as I mentioned before, to justify building such powerful systems. And I'm maybe going to be a little contentious here by saying I don't hate the government. I try not to hate anything. I find what we're experiencing now is just today's particular flavor or brand of a repeating theme, and that is the human species cannot deal with power. And most people understand that and even have lived experiences with it. So what we need to do, in my opinion, is to embrace that characteristic of humanity and not build systems or structures or societies that allow large imbalances of power between groups to unfold, because that will just, it just ends up in disaster every time. So it might be the government today, it might be anyone who has power, just it ends up being such a corruptive force. So I advocate in the book for moving towards a restructuring of society based on inherent reputation and smaller scale interactions where we can actually embrace humanity's characteristics rather than going with systems of aggregated power that time and time again have just ended in devastation.
And ended up, well, they fail, but they cost a lot along the way. They cost a lot to the essence of the human being, to that spirit that we talked about earlier. Free will is a favourite of mine. And you mentioned free will earlier. I am astounded at the number of people who are willing and so willingly prepared to hand over their free will. Without your free will, the true essence of you cannot survive, and you are no longer an incredible, unique human being. The one thing that I would really like for people to take away from our conversation today, Paul, is for them to have a greater idea of the implication of these identification policies on them, their families, and their future. What have you got in the book about that?
Yeah, so that's a very important point, actually. I devote another chapter to technology because I think generally people are fairly tech illiterate, at least in regards to what happens behind the scenes. And this is one of the unique cases that we experience this time around, let's put it, because it's the first time we've had high-speed digital systems. Now, I've noticed that there's this general tendency to conflate the word, again, one word, digital, with cleanliness, with superiority. It has. I remember when they were phasing out VHS and moving to DVD, and they used to run these advertisements where they showcase the audio and visual superiority of digital technology. And you know, ever since then, people have just, and they're quite right. You know, I remember the crackly phone call, tethered analog phone calls of the past versus what we're enjoying now. So I get that people have an association of digital technology with immediacy, with benefit, with all these positive things. But I thought it necessary to ease people in with a bit of a crash course in engineering and uncover a little bit what digital data is. Now, the way I explain it is that these digital systems have certain properties that we haven't seen in the past, and I run through some of their characteristics. But what we have now is a system where when data is captured, it is immediate, it can be global, in the blink of an eye, and it is permanent. So in days past, you know, if you lost an identity document, it was a piece of paper, it was a physical manifestation of information. You could lose it, or even if you didn't lose it, it would age with time. And in that regard, it had similarities with our own lifespan. You know, a physical document or some representation of our identity characteristics would age as we do. And, you know, once we die, what relevance is that identity document anymore? It's just a shadow of the human spirit that was. But today, there is high definition, immediate information available to goodness knows who, that will persist long after our lifespan. So digital data has the curious property of separating us from our experiences. And I explain a little bit why that is in the book, but it separates us in space and time from our data. And I'll give you a little example. We think that this conversation, or the conversations we have on our digital mobile phones, are sequential. You know, I say a few words and they go through in that order, and you hear them. But what's happening behind the scenes is interlacing or interweaving. So the system will actually break up my words. Of course, this is infinitesimally small, you can't notice it. And it will send little bits of the latter part of the word before the former part of the word. It'll mix them up. And this is just one example of how digital data can be manipulated in ways that we don't understand with our physical senses. It's called burst error correction. It means that if you have a dropout in the line, you don't lose a continuous chunk. It'll be such a small bit that's kind of out of sequence. When it's reassembled, you won't even know that it's dropped out. I mean, Again, that's a great benefit, but I use that as an example to help people think about the nefarious side of digital data, or how it could be weaponized with permanence in the future, because there's no real way to relate to digital data with our lived experiences and our senses. They're very much analog and linear. They're the VHS cassette that you had to rewind to return, as opposed to the streaming service where you can just jump halfway through. So I think there is a general case of digital illiteracy. There's this unfortunate association with cleanliness and better. And as an engineer, I make the case that it's very rarely, if not never, the case that something is just uniformly better than, or universally better than something else. It's all about costs and trade-offs. We need to understand that if we're subjecting the echoes of our human essence into these monolithic, centralized digital infrastructures that will far outlive us, we need to understand what the implications are. And no matter how many mental gymnastics I do, I just can't see the trade-off being worth it there. You know, saving a little bit of time going through a smart gate at customs, or generally it's the kind of abstract safety and convenience aspects that are on the plus side of this. And I just can't see, you know, when you actually look deeply at what's happening behind the scenes, that outweighs the potential dangers, especially when I make the case that identity is uniquely able to be weaponized against people.
That's a talk all in itself, isn't it? And it's a very important part of this. But I do love those two words, costs and trade-offs. There are costs and trade-offs in this that I don't think people have really considered enough, what it is going to cost them and what will trade it off. And you were talking about digital data and our own identity. Now, I'm not sure how many people realise you no longer have a title to the home you thought you bought. Once upon a time, you very proudly had the title to your home. You don't have that anymore. It was taken away a long time ago, and it's only when you might go to the bank, who is supposed to keep your title with the mortgage, that you'll find that they'll say, oh, we don't have it. You're like, well, where did that go? Oh, well, it's all been centralised. It's all gone to Landgate. Good words, Landgate around here. So all of these little things have been seeping in and moving in on us behind the scenes without realising. And then this faster technology, I'm astounded to hear the words that you said are being used for it. It's like, oh my gosh, this just does not align with what it is to be human, what it is to have this human experience. It's unreal. But Paul, there's been such a treasure of information, and it's more than information. I think we are overloaded with information. But you've raised some fantastic things for people to be able to have a greater understanding of digital ID, and having this conversation opens the door for the opportunity for people to go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And maybe my reliance on the government making me safe isn't such a good thing. Maybe I could be more responsible for my own safety, and maybe being watched everywhere I go is not really what I want to do when I get up at 6 a.m. to have my coffee. There is so much, as you know, from writing your book that this topic covers, and we've only just begun today. So, Paul, as we close off today, is there anything particular that you would like the people to think about? And also, please let us know how anyone can reach out to you that might like to have a conversation with you or might like to get one of the first copies of the book.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure, Gwenda. I guess if there's one piece of low-hanging fruit I'd like to leave with someone, or anyone who's interested in just devoting some thought to this topic, is the issue of biometrics. So unlike passwords or email addresses that, you know, when they're leaked, or phone numbers or driver's licenses, all of these things can be replaced. But whenever you digitize your biometrics, you know, you use Face ID to unlock your phone, or your fingerprints, these are immutable. That means they can't be changed. You're using your physical characteristics to unlock digital systems. I would steer well clear of that, would be my strong advice, because these things, you know, travel with us on the arc of our life, and they're not easily changed when they're leaked. And the danger is when you have your biometrics, or any data, identifying data really, but particularly with biometrics and genetic information, you enable people to more easily apply their prejudices upon you. And I'll just, before I move on to how people can reach out to me, I'll just leave you with one other thought. And again, this comes from my study of Nazi Germany and labels. So in 1930s Germany, they had a term called antisocial. Now, I'm sure most people hear that term and say, well, why would we want antisocial people in our society? It'd be a good idea to improve that, wouldn't it? But if you were labeled antisocial in Germany, you were subjected to egregious human rights violations. So the forced abortion, sterilization, child confiscation, marriage annulment, slave labor, and of course, murder as well. But the definition of that term, the power to define that term, was placed in the hands of the few. And antisocial ended up being defined or covered conditions like epilepsy, mental disabilities, alcoholism or depression, which were all quite understandable at the time, and a wide array of other things that were loosely interpreted by the police on the street. So you would wake up every day and not know whether your characteristics fit the criteria for arrest or any of the other things that I just mentioned under that one label. So I just make the case that prevention is better than cure here. And I would be very careful about biometrics. So yeah, that's a good place to start. I think I would avoid that before you, as a segue to learning a little bit more about the importance of your identity. In terms of reaching out to me. Sorry, Gwen.
I'm glad I trust my instincts, because when new phones and things asked, you know, put your thumbprint or your face, I was like, no, I don't think so. And I just had this thing that, no, it's not what I want to do. Now I understand why. So thanks for that, Paul.
Good instincts. How can people reach 2 seconds. Sure. So the best is probably my website. So it's paulgconlon.com, or you can go to citizen1onebook.com. It's the same site, and you'll find my socials link there as well. Basically, Paul G. Conlon on all the popular socials as well. And I'm quite easy to happy to connect with people, help them on this journey, and spread awareness of the importance of this, because I think self-sovereignty and understanding the richness of our identity just invariably will lead to a better life.
Absolutely.
I would love to leave people with a better life. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to having you back. I've got a couple of people that we're going to have a panel discussion with on this topic in the next couple of months. So looking forward to it. Thank you. Thank you for everything you've brought to the world today, because, you know, we are out there in the world. You have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again soon.
And to you, Gwenda, my pleasure. Thank you very much.